Tarantino is kind of a Marmite director. You either love him or you hate him. I, for one, love him. I don't love Marmite though, that shit's disgusting. As a long-time fan, I was really looking forward to Hateful Eight, particularly since it was a return to the Western genre, which War Quentin had proven to be adept at with Django. Now, it is a good movie, I will stress that. But I have to say, I came away from the whole thing kind of disappointed. It's easily one of Tarantino's worst directorial efforts, above only Death Proof and Jackie Brown in my personal opinion. That said, Tarantino's worst is still better than a lot of people's best. There is a reason, after all, that he and Spielberg are probably the only two directors with the same kind of mainstream pull that most A-listers have. Dude's got a super good track record. So it may be here that I'm holding the lad to impeccably high standards, but if I'm completely sincere, this movie almost made my Where It Fails series, and though in the end I decided the film was too good for that treatment, as a whole, its flaws are pretty major. There's two cuts of this movie. I saw the 2.5 hour version, as nowhere near me was showing Tarantino's preferred extended cut, but that's what you get for living in the arse end of Norway. At first I was gutted. I really wanted to see everything the movie had to offer without any missing content, but after my viewing was over, I was kind of relieved, since even the shorter take of the movie was sorta too long. Tarantino's films have always been canny talky, but the lads and lass in this movie narf go on. The dialogue is never dull, it's always well written and dripped in that Quentin signature style, but some of it just doesn't need to exist. If you compare this to, say, his debut feature, Reservoir Dogs, you could argue that, in that movie, the whole conversation at the beginning surrounding Madonna's Like a Virgin and the debate of whether or not waitresses deserve tips could be removed from the whole production and you'll still get the same narrative. And you kind of wouldn't be wrong. But in that dialogue, he at least gave us insight into all of the characters. We know who's the tough guy boss, who's the logical kind of wormy type. You kind of just get a sense of all their ideologies and how they fit in the world around them. In the opening of Hateful Eight, a similar thing happens. You see, the plot follows the exploits of 7 violent men and 1 woman who are trapped in a small rest stop while they wait out a storm. Each of them have their own backgrounds and reasons for being there, though we're led to believe some of them mightn't be true. And the real pull of the movie is just watching their personalities clash. In the initial scenes, everyone gets a chance to chat about who they are and whatnot, but then they just keep talking, reiterating points we've already learned and dragging out the scene. The movie is also kind of weirdly structured. Instead of feeling like one long film, it instead opts to almost be like several short films that all follow a continuous narrative, even going so far as to literally separate the film into chapters. This makes the movie have a real stop-start kind of pacing. Just when a scene comes to its peak, you'll get a cut to black and then a chapter number, and the whole scene is jumped in time and suddenly you're really taken out of the whole thing and it feels like the movie has to now recapture the interest it just had. These narrative jumps worked in Tarantino's Pulp Fiction because we were moving between multiple places and characters. It also served a narrative purpose. If we follow Pulp Fiction chronologically, for example, then one character ends on a particularly grim note. With the jumble order, we end on a much more positive beat. In Hateful Eight, we stay with the same characters in the same place 90% of the time. And as far as I could tell, there was no real change in the plot progression gained by a jumble order. What was particularly awkward about these chapter separations is at one point they start suddenly being accompanied by narration. This kind of comes totally out of left field and I don't have the slightest idea why it's in there. I mean, it isn't awful, it's just kind of pointless, especially when you're already so far into the film. Now, there's one other crazy huge flaw that really bothered me, but I can't talk about it without spoiling a huge plot point. So I'll leave that till after the review. Until that point, here's some positives that I thought the movie really excelled at and make this film worth watching. Easily, the best thing about the whole production is the absolutely stellar cast of characters. These wandering band of thugs, misfits and bounty hunters are so bloody watchable. Every one of them is so very alive and full of personality. They each manage to consistently bounce off each other with all the energetic elasticity of a rubber ball against a wall. Almost everything works about them. The writing perfectly gives each character their own individual voice, and the performances are steeped in unique mannerisms and delivery. Well, I know I said the film was too long, and I stand by that. These guys made it so that it was never boring. Setting the film almost entirely in a small building could have been an absolutely fatal move that killed interest in even the most hardened audience member. But here, Tarantino's absolute confidence in his own screenwriting and cast was well placed. The story itself also had some really inspired moments. Again, I don't want to get into too much for fear of spoilers, but highlights included a sort of alternate western take on the Who's the Rat scene from Reservoir Dogs, several interesting developments surrounding characters' histories and a letter, and a surprisingly poignant friendship which made for a delightful sort of crowd-pleasing moment, the kind of which Tarantino usually avoids. Does the good outweigh the bad? Almost definitely. And were this by any other director who I maybe didn't hold to such standards, I might have been pleasantly surprised with the whole thing. So yeah, it has its problems, including one huge one that really you should discover for yourself, but I don't think it ruins the entire thing enough to warrant not seeing it. For the most part, it's a lot of crazy, violent, nicely shot fun. And, to be honest, still worth the price of the ticket. Okay, review over. Close the window now if you haven't seen the film, because we're going to get into spoiler territory in 3, 2, 1. What the actual fuck was up with that rape scene? Now look, I'm not opposed to rape scenes, which is kind of a weird sentence, but I don't think personally that any art form, including film, should ever be forced away from taboo subjects. Sometimes there is a point in such a scene that is inherently important to the narrative or the message the movie is trying to convey. Take for example Irreversible, a movie I don't even like that much, with a particularly brutal and violent rape that far outdoes the Hateful Eight's attack in terms of unpleasant realism. That movie needed its rape scene. Without it, the whole film and its message falls apart. Or even take Pulp Fiction, again another film by Tarantino to feature a rape. The assault in that movie was actually important. We're told by the film the whole way through that Marcellus Wallace is the guy you do not fuck with. He's the boss, the big shot, the intimidating mob guy, and then he's raped. And you see him in this humiliating position of absolute vulnerability, and it completely redirects your whole perceptions of the character in a way that works exceptionally well without being tasteless. And this also acts as the catalyst to the final payoff of his and Butcher's relationship. Hateful Eight, on the other hand, almost crumbles entirely for nothing more than a cheap shock. The rape in question occurs at the hands of Jackson's character, who regales the story of how he raped the son of a Confederate he is speaking to in an effort to antagonize him. There's a million reasons why this just fails to work. Firstly, it is completely redundant. Remove the Confederate character from the whole picture and call this movie The Hateful Seven, and you have the same movie. The guy only exists to be antagonized and shot, and out of all the characters present, he's the least interesting and fleshed out. Secondly, it kills any love you have for Sam Jackson's character. At this point in the movie, you are aware he's done bad things, but in the harsh environment of a racially divided Old West, you kind of see why in an ensemble of villains, he becomes the only one you can cling to as being the hero. Yeah, I get that Tarantino's whole thing is to have no truly good souls in all of his characters, but that's never stopped me rooting for them. In past movies, he's managed to make you like hitmen or bank robbers or violent gangs. This feels like the exact opposite and just comes across as a shock for shock's sake. One that totally alienates us from the guy we are presented with as being the protagonist. It was enough to give him grit just to find out about his violent past. The rape feels like total overkill and just makes you not like the guy. Thirdly, it doesn't even know what tone it wants to take. The scene starts off suspenseful, then it hits a big shock moment with the reveal in a way that frames it like you should condemn the whole thing, and you're waiting for it to make some dramatic point before it just passes the whole thing off as a joke, with the tongue-in-cheek line and delivery of, as Mayor Marquis Warren captured his audience with tales of black dick and white mouth. It's just pointless. It serves no purpose. And not only does it extend the narrative needlessly, it does so at the expense of almost ruining one of the characters, and it's such a shame because the rest of the movie, in spite of a couple of flaws, is pretty damn good. As I said earlier, I'd still say go see it. It's just, man, does this scene drag it down. And it makes it especially hard to defend Tarantino to his critics, who claim he's deeply cynical and just uses violence to shock when he has scenes like this. For the record, I don't personally think these arguments stand, and nor do I think this scene is reflective of Tarantino's work as a whole. I just thought for the purpose of review, it was worth deconstructing in this way.